Welcome back, Ninja community and people who want to learn a few things about a tonfa and a few things about a baton. Even if this side handle wasn't present, some of these moves are also ambiguous with a regular baton. So before I get into showing some information on the tonfa or a side handle baton or even a baton, I will cover a little bit of my quality statement and disclaimer. And most of it is that if you practice any of this, it's at your own risk, and I'm not responsible for any misuse of materials. This is essentially just my intellectual property that I'm allowing other people to view. So, before I get into some of the techniques of how to use a tonfa, as a lot of people are just handed one of these and don't even know how to use it, right? So, running through some of the techniques that someone well trained on a tonfa would know, or just basically a small amount of it. This is as much as I can really cover in this video. So here we go. There are several ways to hold a tonfa, right? Depending on the situation you're in. Now, one of the best ways to hold a tonfa in a defensive manner is from this position here, because there's a lot of inward blocks, right? There's even outward blocks that can be done from that position. So this position here is usually a block or downward strike, right? If you're blocking with a downward strike with this, by blocking by striking, that is actually a technique. You can block a strike by striking against the strike, right? If someone is throwing a kick, this right here could be used to block against a kick. You're also striking against their leg, so they probably wouldn't be too happy about it. One of the techniques that is very useful with a tonfa is the wrap shot, or the hook, right? It comes from this position here, right? And it's basically just throwing out kind of like a boxer's hook, right, to the side. So this wrap shot, if you notice, when you make the strike, you want to make sure that the spine of the weapon is aligned against the swing, right? If I'm throwing a punch or throwing a swing in this way, I want to make sure that the spine of the weapon is in line. Now, a tonfa with a fixed handle can do a lot more damage than one that has ball bearings. With just a smaller amount of skill and technique, it's fairly easy. So, a little bit more about that wrap shot, right? As my opponent might step into the strike. This strike here, if they had stepped in by becoming more aggressive, right? That strike there is a lot more powerful than the strike out here. Compared, if you look here, this strike here is probably one of the most powerful, only comparable to out here, like the swing on a baseball bat, right? It's not a baseball bat. This can do far more damage than a baseball bat in the hands of someone who is skilled to use it. It's also a very powerful grappling weapon. Say, if my opponent was on the ground, right, and I wanted them to turn over rather than hit them like this, which if I was striking them while they were on the ground using this end here, the intention of this weapon as a martial arts weapon passed down through eons, the intention held this way by striking is usually to break bones. That is the intention of the weapon. That is very difficult to argue against. In fact, if you can't dislocate someone's jaw or their knee using it held this way, then you probably need more training. Now, if you ever see someone holding a tonfa with the spine here across the top of the arm, like on the thumb side. When it's held like this, the intention of this weapon is usually to do deadly strikes, things that are considered lethal by nature, lethal by its very technique, right? Or highly deadly. Okay, but I will not cover those techniques in this video. Just pointing out that if the tonfa is held like this, there are highly deadly strikes, lethal techniques that could be utilized from this position. Okay, from this position here, like I mentioned, the intention of the weapon held like this and doing strikes with it is to cause serious damage. There are a few exceptions. If I was using it two-handed and my opponent had some sort of shield or something to block with, right? This could be used in a raking motion against whatever they're using to block with, and taking that resistance that they would be using to redirect it and hit them in the face. Okay, so it isn't always just as simple as how the weapon is held, right? So the next thing I'll cover, of course, will be held this way. It's one of the least likely ways to hold a tonfa, but in a real combat situation, you might wind up in this position, especially if your opponent had the tonfa. That's part of training, right? In all types of situations. If my opponent had a knife, this would very likely be how I might use the weapon, right? As I'm covering part of my wrist and preventing grabs and joint locks of a normal nature, right? If I train this way and my opponent doesn't, then I am at an advantage against my opponent. If I could grab here, simply turning this way, my opponent might not have much of a choice but to go in the direction I put them. Just like if my opponent were on the ground, I wouldn't be throwing strikes with them with the weapon, or even like this. If you draw all the way back up here, this is not effective. Think of it more like a baseball bat. If you draw all the way back up here and they're on the ground and you're not, this isn't very effective. Usually someone does this motion here if they are intensely emotional at the time. They're not using proper technique. These strikes, if they were on the ground, the full swing, like anything above this is less effective, right? Human nature is to raise it higher if they intend to do a lot of damage. But technique, a lot more damage can be done more easily. But if your intention is not to cause damage to your opponent while they're on the ground, as you probably might have just been handed one of these and never actually taught how to use it. I'll get into some of that later. Okay. If I wanted them to turn over, instead of yelling at them to turn over and then just hitting them if they don't, right? I could actually use this as one of the ways it's intended, by actually pushing it up underneath them, right? Up underneath their chest, right? There's several different ways to do it. And physically turning them over, right? Because they wouldn't have much of a choice but to go with it. They might be a bit of discomfort, right? Because it's not very comfortable. And you should probably try to experience it yourself before you actually do it. But it is a lot more effective than just hitting them until they agree to stop fighting human nature, which human nature when you are struck is to duck in, is to duck and tuck. If you see someone going into a fetal position, they're likely not resisting, right? If they start doing that curl, that is basic common sense. And when I see people out there who really don't know what they're talking about, trying to defend anything that's less than either excessive force or lack of training, it's like, how can you, like, especially after the fact, how could you do that? But anytime someone actually learns a tonfa from someone who has been taught how to use a tonfa, they're usually told some of the history about it because it has a purpose, right? The tonfa was originally a crutch. You should keep that in mind when using a tonfa, because this weapon evolved from an improvised weapon that was intended to help someone, which is ironic because now it can be used to make someone need a crutch, right? So, if you're using this, chances are the person might actually need some help. If you use this with bearing that in mind, you're less likely to throw strikes at them while they're on the ground. And striking someone while they're on the ground could be potentially lethal to them. Okay, so you could actually just turn them over. Now you could actually keep your knee there and twist them and start breaking their back if you know the proper technique, right? If you know the proper technique. Some of the techniques with this, some people used this weapon against people who had better weapons, like swords. Bear that in mind. Okay, there are also some other strikes that can be done with a tonfa. Some of them are just basically punches like this. You'd want to keep this upright. But if you're doing the wrap shot, you want to do it this way, right? And it's done this way for several reasons. The wrap shot is, right? If my opponent was blocking, like stepped in and blocked, when I do this wrap shot, if my arm is in a pronate position, they're less likely to hit this flesh part. They'd be striking against bone, right? If they hit that flesh part, it might be difficult to hang on to your weapon. So that wrap shot looks like this. Now, if the wrap shot was blocked, right, by someone throwing up blocks, it could be used as a fluid weapon and hit them in the face, right? That is one of the most devastating things about a tonfa. It's very fundamental. Okay, now as a baton, there are of course strikes against the jaw, strikes against the knee that are just as effective at knocking my opponent out or slowing them down. If I really wanted to cause serious damage, I would be striking it with it like this, as that was its intention. Okay, there are also just the underneath strike, right? From here, striking at the chin or the groin. That pressure point usually knocks someone out, right? If you hit that, usually knocks somebody out. If you hit underneath the groin, that usually immobilizes your opponent enough to either get away, or if you are law enforcement, a hit to the groin could easily equalize an unfair fight. That's just basic common sense. It might be very damaging. However, I'm just going to be honest with you. If I was up against 3 people at the same time, you know, fairness is kind of relative. So it depends on the specific situation. Not every situation is going to be the same. If I were fighting 3 people, I am not going to be fighting fair, because it's already unfair as there's 3 people and, you know, they're fighting against me. So we'll definitely be at a disadvantage on their part, at least. So if you've watched the video so far, you should probably hit like, hard like a ninja, subscribe to be alerted for when I do videos on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, and share. Check out my other videos. I'll keep moving along with this video. Okay. Another reason to hold a tonfa this way is it can be used as a choking weapon. Could be. I advise against using it as a choking weapon. It's usually if someone is being choked, the instinct, of course, is that their life could be considered in jeopardy, and they might actually be fighting back to save their life. You should never fight someone while they're afraid. I've seen a good bit of fights where somebody fought beyond their skill level and was successful. Should never fight someone while they're afraid. Okay, so we covered some of those underneath strike right there, right? There's also the strike here, right? This strike here is usually done if someone is throwing a punch. Now, if you accidentally throw it above the arm, it could connect with their neck, which is basically like, imagine a punch, but this much surface area, so it does far more damage. So bear that in mind, right? If your intention is to immobilize them and they threw a punch, this hit here running underneath their arm usually connects to the armpit, right? Connects right up under here. And if someone takes a strike at the armpit from throwing some sort of straight jab or punch, chances are they're not going to be throwing punches with that arm anymore, at least for a little while, because it's not very comfortable. It's usually like kind of like that Charlie horse thing where you like on the leg, right? Kind of like that, right? Okay, so there are other things about using a tonfa. You don't have to drastically alter your movements of whatever basic fundamental that you have, right? A lot of basic fundamental is moving, like stepping, right? When you're moving around and when you're stepping or striking as you step, you want to make sure that back leg stays on the ground at least some, so you're going to be dragging the tip of your toe, right? Because if you're struck while you're moving, you still have balance. You're not going to be thrown off balance from just one strike or push. So let's see what's some more. Now, I was once consulted for a complete combative system. There are some gag, what's the term? There's some gag rules on it, but what I can say is I was against the combative system that they were pushing through, and it was basically politicians that were voting on it. Voting on it or passing it as some sort of regulation. My comments on the matter was nearly completely ignored. I was told that some of what I said would be taken under consideration, etc., which is basically telling me that they really wasn't going to be listening. Okay, so some of my first lessons that I ever had on a tonfa was from a 10th degree black belt. A lot of times people are just handed this weapon and they're not even trained on how to use it. That fault falls onto whoever passes those policies, right? If it's private security or if it's law enforcement, it falls on the politicians that spent years cutting budgets and making it so horrible, making the training so horrible, right? I'm going to cover some more on the tonfa. Now, one of the things about a tonfa is how you draw the tonfa, right? If you're wearing it on the opposite side that you intend to use with it, then that makes it less effective at using it in combat or in a situation where you would need to use it. So deciding where you wear what, if someone else does that, that is a bit asinine, right? Now, if you're wearing it over here, usually you'd be drawing it this way, which would flag your movement, and pulling it this way usually puts your wrist at an awkward position. Someone could easily lock you down and you would not be able to pull this weapon, right? Easily. Okay, even if you manage to pull it out with both hands, there are fewer strikes that can be done as you draw the weapon, as sort of a quick draw, right? If you wear it on the side you intend to use with it, there are even more techniques that can be done from that position, right? As from this position here, you could draw into a strike. Or if they're further away, you could continue the strike out here and go into a wrap shot. Even if my opponent had ducked in, what I have behind my opponent is I have a stick behind his head, right? There are a lot of techniques that could be used with a tonfa. And it is a very powerful grappling weapon, or standing grappling weapon. Okay, so this drawing the tonfa looks like this, right? Straight out. If they're further away, it is straight out in a wrap shot. Okay. I've seen those changes implemented as early as 2014. So, just going off on a rant here, like you have the old military, like the old Army combative system. It was changed because of how difficult it was for law enforcement to deal with just the basic soldier, the basic E1 soldier. If someone riddled through the paperwork, that's what they would see. That the whole reason they changed an entire combative system was because it was a highly effective system. So then they made it worse, making it to where police and law enforcement could deal with veterans much easier, which is a bit stupid. That's my opinion. Instead of training our military better, they decided to start training I'll restate that. Instead of training the police better, they decided to start training the military worse. So, fatality rates don't lie. Conflict time paired with that isn't going to lie. I definitely say I might be right on this. But anyways, what we're looking at nowadays is you have people who are just handed one of these, trusted to use this to help people because that's what it was intended initially, right? It was a crutch. And they don't even know the techniques that would prevent them from looking like a villain on social media or on YouTube. How much sense does that make? And you also see a lack of it being covered in the news. However, it's blown up on social media, especially locally, right? So, the regulations on teaching someone martial arts is a lot. I've looked into opening businesses before. I am much better at just simply privately contracting with someone for certain dollar amounts to teach, because that's still kind of like that's basically covered under just having a skill. But the regulations on opening up establishments, they're usually set up for only a particular style that functions in a particular way, having so many people, right? It's gotten so bad that usually experts don't even teach at police academies because they don't pay them enough. Like, usually experts have schools and other things to run, and there's so many regulations that they have to follow on those schools that they don't even bother teaching law enforcement. And the law enforcement that have picked up something, they usually have paid for it and learned through other sources. That is the sad truth. If you agree with that, comment. If you disagree, feel free to comment on that. I've just heard more conversations from people who's actually law enforcement, former correction officers, and correction officers. So many people say of how much they've trained on this. I won't release names on that one, But oh, transitions here. Transitions. Just dropping here, doing kind of a roll, right? This right here just gets you used to it, and stopping up here, right? You could drop back down to here again and do the same thing, or you could lay it back this way, coming to this position, right? Turning it over here. You can also practice just moving it around at your wrist, as this right here might really happen, right? In a real bind up where someone else's hands are on your weapon. There are training techniques and training methods that can be done safely and broken down into smaller pieces, right? But just covering a little bit in this video, there's also a technique if someone were behind you or had hold of you from behind, you could easily get out of that situation, right? Breaking it down for an individual is fairly simple. Showing it in a video is a bit more complicated to actually understand what's going on. So, again, if you liked the video, hit like, hard like a ninja. Like, comment, subscribe, and share, especially if you want to see more videos where I cover some techniques on various weapons. And check me out on Facebook under my artist name or my 10th ninja name, Mel L. That's M-E-L-E-L. I have an Instagram, but you'll just have to be ninja and go figure out what that is. So until next time, stay ninja, my friends.